This is Tech and Politics, and my name is Andreas Jungherr. Welcome back to the podcast accompanying the lecture series Digital Media in Politics and Society at the University of Bamberg. In this episode, we will focus on how challenges fail and how to assess their legitimacy. We have now talked extensively about how digital media enable challenges to institutions. But of course, this alone does not guarantee their success. Yes, digital media might help identify and document the weaknesses of institutions, their crises and conflicts. They might help challenges to form, be brought forward, and reach a broad public. But success of challenges is of course not determined by these opportunities alone. Instead, success relies on various context conditions and their specific structural embeddedness. The other question we repeatedly ran into was how to assess challenges. As we have seen, some challenges might be judged as strengthening democracy and empowering people, while others might achieve the opposite. Now, how can we as researchers address this question? Without, of course, attributing the challenges we happen to sympathize with strengthening effects, and those we dislike detrimental effects. We will focus on these questions in this episode. Consistently discussing the different ways in which digital media enable challenges to established institutions might one leave with a not uncertain feeling that these challenges are bound to succeed, and that the days of established institutions are over. But casting a glance left and right, and you will see established institutions apparently doing just fine. How do these observations go together? While digital media have enabled challenges, they also have provided new opportunities for social control. We see this most clearly with digital challenges to autocracies. One of the strongest tales about the transformative potential of digital media is connected to their role during the so-called Arab Spring. From December 2010 to 2012, a number of Arab countries were swept by local revolts of citizens demanding for more democracy and greater accountability of their rulers. Digital media featured strongly in these revolts as tools for coordination, tactical support, documentation of the events, and establishment of connections with the international community. The early success of these protests and their public uses of digital media contributed to the public impression of digital media as powerful technologies with the potential to destabilize even strong authoritarian regimes. Subsequent events indicate that both the hopes for sustainable change through these revolts, as well as the contribution of digital media to their short-lived success, were overblown. But not only the West was watching. Authoritarian regimes all over the world paid attention to the events and determined not to go down the same route. As a consequence, they started to increase their efforts to control digital communication infrastructures and companies in their countries. While these attempts at first seemed to Western leaders and commentators futile, subsequent efforts of Chinese and Russian governments showed that state control of digital communication was possible. Especially the Chinese efforts stand out in this, with the Great Firewall cutting off Chinese users from the Western digital media and allowing the government to censor content. Going beyond access to information, the Chinese social credit system is an even more powerful attempt at monitoring, incentivizing, and punishing behavior of citizens through the state. While its actual workings and effects are still ill-documented, it stands as a powerful marker of what degrees of digital control are available to authoritarian governments. Under these conditions, digital media provide only limited, if any, opportunities for challenges to the status quo to form through information or coordination. Let's take it closer at home. Since the early days of digital media, digital structures have become continuously more centralized. When in the past, challengers of the status quo could publish a website on their own server, today most people use central hubs, like Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, to publish or access information. The companies running these platforms, therefore, have potentially the opportunity to elevate or hide information that they see in conflict with their business. Recently, voices have been raised asking for greater responsibility of companies running these services to identify and censor harmful and incendiary content around politics. The most visible of those was Twitter's decision to suspend the account of then US President Donald Trump after him inciting rioters at the US Capitol on January 6, 2021. While the decision was highly contested at the time, after losing access to Twitter and other social media platforms, Donald Trump never achieved the same power over the media coverage he wielded through Twitter. Well, arguably, the discourse on Twitter did not lose much through the forced exit of Donald Trump, but this episode shows the power companies wield that run central digital infrastructures. By deciding whom and what topics to allow access to their users, these companies are central hubs with the ability to control public discourse, if they exercise this power or not. Beyond increased opportunities for central control, challenges to the status quo also have to contend with the persistence of structures. Even if challenges are enabled through new opportunities provided by digital media, their challenge still has to engage existing structures. Overturning or changing the status quo depends on more than putting out sharply worded tweets or coordinating protests. Structures are deeply embedded in society, and many people support the status quo. This can be a relief if we think of challenges intended to weaken democracy or attack the rights of others. Or this can be depressing if we think of challenges trying to deepen democracy and increase true representation. In our expectations for the impact of digitally enabled challenges, we always have to consider the contextual conditions these challenges are facing. Sometimes, the opportunities provided by digital media will shift the balance toward challenges. Sometimes they won't. But in any case, digital media will increase the repertoire of available actions to challenges of the status quo. Over the course of this episode, we have encountered a wide variety of digitally enabled challenges. We have encountered challenges intent on shifting the political agenda in order to address the interests and needs of future generations, such as Fridays for Future. We also have encountered challenges intent on foregrounding the ways societies fail many of their citizens by disregarding their rights and bodily safety, such as Black Lives Matter or Me Too. But we've also encountered challenges intent on limiting the rights of political participation of many groups in society, such as far-right extremism or far-right populism. Looking at the diversity of goals digital media is used to achieve, it is clearly not possible to state that digital media is either enabling those aiming to strengthen democracy or those bent on weakening it. In the early days, writers like Castells seemed to assume that any challenge of the status quo was a good one, and that digital media therefore decisively would weaken hegemonic or patriarchal structures and empower citizens. In light of today's challenges by populist far-right actors, this seems premature and actually wishful thinking. Instead of cheering on any challenge to the status quo, we need to look closely and be explicit in our normative evaluation in why we assess it either as a positive or a negative challenge. For this, let us quickly recap what democracy is all about, and based on that, develop categories that help us in assessing digitally enabled challenges with regard to their impact on democracy. In the earlier episodes on artificial intelligence, we already have talked about constitutive features of democracy and how they can be touched by technological change. These features also allow us to assess the impact of challenges to the status quo and come to normative assessments of their justification. As we already have encountered, the discussion of and literature on democracy is vast and multifaceted. Discussions range from the philosophical foundations, normative ideals, historical expressions, empirical variations, to legal and procedural questions. But three important characteristics of democracy consistently feature in these discussions. These are, for one, free and fair elections as a process to establish the basis for collectively binding decision-making. Second, believe in the ability of people to make decisions for themselves about societal and political questions. And third and finally, equality of people with regard to representation and rights. Each of these characteristics allows us to assess challenges to the status quo. First, how does the challenge impact the representation and rights of groups? Is the goal the extension of political representation and rights to marginalized groups? Or is the goal the restricting representation and rights to groups somehow conceived as the true electorate? While any hard and fast rule is bound to fail right off the bat, challenges aiming to extend representation and citizen rights have a better case for strengthening democracy than those aiming to restrict representation and citizen rights. Second, are we dealing with challenges that accept the rules of free and fair elections, or do they, for whatever reason, reject the binding power of elections? The rejection of free and fair elections as a binding process of collective decision-making is a crucial warning of anti-democratic tendencies and challenges of the status quo. This being said, if challenges can bring forward specific and credible grievances how elections in practice are neither free nor fair, but do not in principle reject election results, this can be seen as supporting and strengthening democracy. Finally, do challenges attack the ability of people to make decisions for themselves, or do they aim to empower them broadly? We currently experience a series of challenges of democratic decision-making in favor of expert rule. Often these challenges are based on the implicit or explicit claim that people would be unable to decide important issues. Either they are not rational enough, lack foresight, or only act in their own narrow self-interest. These challenges often suggest some sort of expert rule or to remove selected important topics from democratic decision-making. In this, these challenges are inherently weakening democracy, even if they might be well-intentioned on moving society along selected paths. Of course, challenges might not fit these questions neatly. There might be dominant and radical factions deviating in the extent of their challenge. Or challenges might vary in their impact on democracy across these questions. Some might fit for the extension of citizen rights, but feel that this is not an issue the public should decide democratically, and the elections not recognizing an extension of the electorate are accordingly not binding. Or there might be challenges aiming to restrict the rights of selected groups in society, but otherwise adhere to the bindingness of elections. As with any framework, these questions have to be assessed carefully and diligently in each examined case, and its results weighted carefully. But if in this process one question would have to suffice, then my money would be on the question whether a challenge aims to extend representation and rights, or whether it aims to restrict them. After all, democracy is about the self-rule of empowered citizens. Without equal rights and representation across groups within society, this remains an elusive goal. Challenges moving societies along a path toward greater equality of rights and representation therefore have a crucial function in strengthening and improving democracy. In the last few episodes, we have discussed the ways digital media enable challenges to institutions. We've also seen that this enabling does not guarantee success. It is also important to note that digital media enable both challenges that arguably can be seen as aiming to strengthen democracy, as well as those weakening it. These observations point to a set of important takeaways for scientific work on digital media. First, we need to improve our understanding of how digital media are actually used in support of challenges of the status quo. This includes work focusing on the uses of digital media in organizations and associated adaptation processes. But this also includes work that focuses on digital artifacts of challenges, such as content posted on social media. Especially the second type of work invites contributions using computational social science. Going further, the varying fates of digitally enabled challenges of the status quo also show that we need to increase our understanding of the contextual conditions for successful challenges. Some of those might be connected to digital media directly, others might not. Still, getting a better grasp of the necessary conditions for successful challenges of the status quo will also allow us to get a better understanding of the contribution of digital media to these successes. This future work also includes extending our analyses to include long-term fates of challenges. For example, for a few months it seemed like the events of the Arab Spring were successful in sustainably changing the balance of power in the countries concerned. A few years later, though, these changes proved to be short-lived and often illusory. work on the political effects of digital media can sometimes appear rather short of breath, with a strong focus on the short term and selected cases of apparently successful users. These studies can be highly instructive, but often fail to fully account for the long-term effects of the use of digital media described. For these studies, then, it is easy to get the impression of their power, while a long-term view might indicate their limits. Given the multiplicity of challenges to the status quo we currently experience, we need to deploy a clear normative framework in their discussion. Some challenges to the status quo are justified, and their success might arguably end up strengthening democracy, or even the very institution they challenge. Others might end up weakening institutions and democracy. In discussing these challenges, our normative assessments must follow clear criteria in order for us not to end up celebrating challenges we happen to support and critiquing those we don't. In this episode, I introduce one possible framework that does just that. The intermediary institutions democracies rely on are far from perfect. For years, the social sciences have pointed out the various ways these institutions fall short, fail to represent all people, or perpetuate injustices. To find these institutions challenged comes therefore as no surprise. Clearly, digital media play a role in enabling the current wave of challenges. Especially the current prevalence of digitally enabled reactionary challenges from the extreme or populist right make it tempting to write off digital media as a tool for political expression or coordination. But this would be a mistake. While some challenges aimed at rolling back citizen representation rights are enabled through digital media, so are many challenges that try to increase both. So, instead of damning digital media in support of the first, or celebrating it for the support of the second type of challenge, we need to develop a better understanding of the underlying mechanisms and subsequent conditions for success. Only this will ensure that we are able to use digital media to strengthen democracies and better societies, instead of falling prey to those using them to weaken both. Here, there clearly remains much to do for social science. So many questions and so little time. At least for today, we need to close. In the next set of episodes, we will discuss the public arena. As always, the script to this episode can be found online on the course website, digitalmedia.andreasjungherr.de. There, you will find detailed sources, references to further reading, links, and preparatory questions for the exam. This was Tech and Politics, the podcast of the Chair for the Governance of Complex and Innovative Technological Systems at the University of Bamberg. I'm Andreas Jungherr. Have fun reading, and see you soon.